Hi, Ollie. Nice
Steve,
to talk to you.
great to see you.
Yeah, well, it's so funny, this strange world. You're connected with people that you've never met. You see their faces, their thumbnails as, their personality in Facebook and whatever. So it's nice to talk.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I've been watching your videos for many years. It's great to finally get the chance to talk.
And, I must admit, before I got involved in all of this online polyglottery, I didn't even know, well, I shouldn't say I didn't know, but the word polyglot was like a strange word to me. And I think a majority of English speakers still don't know what the word polyglot means. And there was this great controversy over it. The word to me has always been linguist. Someone who likes languages, who speaks languages, is a linguist. Anyway, we won't get into that discussion. But a lot of people always ask, polyglots like you and me, how do you learn more than one language? How do you maintain more than one language? Isn't there interference from one language to another? How do you deal with juggling all these languages? So maybe you could start just commenting on that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm also someone that kind of dislikes these labels of polyglot and linguist. I think it's unhelpful a lot of the time. It's unhelpful to the general conversation of what we want to do, which is to encourage people to learn languages. For me, I am someone with no language background from childhood. So when I was 18, 19, I hadn't learned any other languages. And so it's been a very, very gradual evolution for me. And in every case, what's led my language learning has been people and relationships. Whether it's a case of I moved to spend a bit of time in Paris when I was about 19. I learned French. Moved to London. My best friend was from Canary Islands, so I learned Spanish. Fell in with a Brazilian crowd and learned Portuguese. Decided to go and teach English in Japan, so I learned Japanese. And it's a very natural evolution like that. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that I have only recently, in the last couple of years, discovered the kind of online world of polyglots, and the kind of the mystique, if you like, that surrounds that. And it's been odd for me because I've kind of had to reverse engineer my thoughts about language learning. It's been such a natural process for me that when I first started doing things online, I didn't really know how to articulate my experiences and my learning process because it was that kind of natural thing. So it's been something, it's an ongoing process for me. And so you asked about maintaining languages.
Well, first of all, interference. Now you've got three, at least three, possibly more, Romance languages. Do you find that that one interferes with the other?
Well, I have found that in the past, but I don't currently find it, and I'll explain why. The time that it was worst for me was actually after I had spent some time learning Italian, and I got to a fairly decent conversational level in Italian, but never kept it up. And so when I took up Spanish after that, I kind of gave Spanish my all. Had a great group of friends in London who were Spanish and spoke that language a lot whilst I was here, and never kept up my Italian. And so kind of going back and forth between that was, I very quickly lost my ability in Italian because I simply didn't give up. After that, when I learned Portuguese, again, I went through an intensive period. I always tend to go through intensive periods of learning one language at a time. And I think that seems to me to be the most effective way of acquiring ability in a language. But then, of course, the question is, with interference, well, how does that affect the language you've learned before? And I remember when I came back from Brazil the first time, I sat down with a Spanish friend of mine in London. And we were speaking a little bit of Spanish, and she just turned around to me and said, "Pero hombre, ¿qué pasa con tu español, tío? Like, what's going on with your Spanish?" I was speaking Spanish with Brazilian Portuguese grammar, which is quite different. And there was significant interference there because I'd spent so much time just immersed in Portuguese. Luckily, what I was able to do was, because I have a music background, I went out and played a lot of Brazilian music in London at the time. I was able to spend a lot of time surrounded by both South American Spanish speakers and Brazilians. And so for a period of time, I would often speak Spanish and Portuguese a lot in one evening. And I often equate that experience to actually learning a new language because I had to learn to kind of manipulate both together. and I was able to get rid of that interference and separate them in my mind. And now I can speak both of them without much interference. But it was a process of learning to do that, and it was far from automatic.
Right. No, I'm glad to hear that you have that problem, because I just this morning before we got started here, I had a 45-minute conversation in Russian, and I speak Russian a lot better than Ukrainian. But I've been focusing on Ukrainian this past month, and then I was at a conference in Toronto where I was speaking Ukrainian all day long. I really struggled. Ukrainian kept on creeping into my Russian. But I think it's partly a matter of how well we know the language, so that I will not confuse French and Spanish. Not a chance.
Sure.
Once I get into Portuguese, I could confuse that with Spanish, Italian. In other words, the better you know the language, the less likely you are to allow other languages to interfere with it. And this gets back to the subject of maintaining the languages too. I find that, if you ask me, okay, like my top 5 languages, I don't have to worry. If I'm going to have a conversation, a meeting, whatever, in Japanese or Chinese, it's not a problem. I don't have to do anything. If, on the other hand, my next 5 group, I might want to spend a day or two, and I tend to work with reading and listening. To me, that's enough. I can't necessarily go out and grab some German speakers and or whatever, and Italian speakers here, or Russian speakers. So, and really, before speaking to my Russian tutor, I should have spent a couple of hours on Link just reading and listening to Russian. So, but then the weakest 5, which includes Ukrainian and Czech and Korean, there I'd almost have to work like a few weeks to get it up to a level where it won't be vulnerable to interference from other languages. So I think the big issue there is, A, in terms of maintaining your language, and B, in terms of protecting it from interference from others, is just how well you know it. And the better you know it, the less you have to prepare.
Well, I think there's no doubt that, I've certainly found that with the languages where I've reached a very strong conversational level, where I've I can operate in the language day in, day out with no particular problems, I've never experienced that dropping to beneath that point.
Right.
Get a bit rusty, but nothing that can't be reactivated within 15 minutes.
Exactly.
I've never had that experience. But like earlier on, I mentioned my Italian, which never really got that high. That was striking for me how easy that was actually lost.
Right.
I wonder if there's. I've heard people mention before that there's potentially neuroplasticity things that come to bear with this. When you speak a language over time, I think your brain. And I have no scientific basis for saying this, but it's just my intuition that your brain does adapt to that way of thinking in the language, because every language has a different approach to explaining ideas and conveying thoughts.
Right.
And I wonder if it's not the case that when your brain gets so used to doing that in one language, it doesn't then kind of demold, if you like. It's there and it's fixed, and you can access that again. But if you only get up to an intermediate level or so, that it isn't quite fixed enough for that to remain permanent. That's my impression. It's probably scientifically.
I don't know. I tell you what I think, though. I think that if you go back to your Italian, or whenever, maybe that already happened, that when you went back to your Italian and you were rusty and you felt you'd lost a lot, it wouldn't take very long before you felt stronger in Italian than you ever had been. In other words,
that's definitely possible.
And my experience has been that, first of all, I often talk about this interleaving, the fact that you go away from Italian, do some Spanish, and then come back to Italian. And then you reconnect some of the neurons that were connected, became unconnected. They become stronger than they ever were. And there's actually neurological evidence that this forgetting and relearning actually strengthens your hold. And the other thing too is learning similar languages where you're most likely to get interference actually helps you. Like with every Slavic language that I learn, I create more confusion, but at the same time, I am confirming some of the basic common patterns, structural patterns of the language. And the same is true with, even though Portuguese has some differences with Spanish, 80-90% of the grammar is the same, and the vocabulary is essentially the same. So you're actually confirming your knowledge of that other language, but you're introducing some interference. If you then go back to the Portuguese or the Italian and work at it for a little while, in my view, you become stronger. The other thing I wanted to say, I don't see it so much as different languages have different, call it cultural ways of approaching things. The way I see it is, you've got these different control centers in your brain. So a person who only speaks one language has got one control center, call it English or Chinese or whatever it might be. And at that point, they're not very flexible. so that the new language with the new patterns, it takes a bit of a more effort then to create this new control center. And then you create a third one and a fourth one, the brain becomes more and more flexible. But by being more flexible, there's also more opportunity that you're looking for a word that goes down the wrong path and you end up in in another language, not the one you wanted to be in, right?
Yeah.
So then you need to kind of work on that language for a while to kind of reestablish the strength of those connections for that control center, that's all.
And I guess the strongest evidence for that is when if one comes to learn their fourth or fifth Romance language, say, or in your case maybe the Slavic language. I mean, it's significantly easier.
Oh yes.
I mean, Portuguese for me, my fourth Romance language was.
Right.
I mean, it really didn't take that long.
No.
And I'm sure that is because of the fact that I'd noticed the connections between the other Romance languages I'd learned and the way you manipulate verbs and nouns and things like that. And it just the logic is there and it stays like that. I haven't had so much experience in language groups, different language groups, so I would be interested to hear whether you've had the similar experience in Slavic.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got my Romance, 5 Romance, 4 Slavic, call it 4 Asian, and then German, Swedish, English, call them Germanic or whatever English is, I'm not so sure. The thing is, like, Swedish is kind of off on its own, so I don't get confused. The Romance languages, I don't really get confused, but the Slavic languages are relatively new for me, so I'm finding more interference, confusion. The other thing is, in learning related languages, I believe that the biggest issue in language learning is words. Words and phrases, period. And I emphasize, comprehension. If you can understand the language, you'll eventually get to speak it. If you can't understand the language, you can't talk to anyone if you don't understand what they're saying to you. The biggest obstacle to comprehension to me is words. If you take Spanish and Portuguese, the vocabulary is like 85-90% the same.
Yeah.
Identifiably the same. Clearly identifiably the same. So if from a passive comprehension point of view, it doesn't take very long for you as a Spanish speaker to learn Portuguese or vice versa. Now, to activate that, of course, you got to speak a lot. But you're already in a position where you can read. And if you do a lot of reading and listening, you can get to where you understand. So to me, vocabulary is big. So in the Slavic languages, the similarity, call it the lexical distance, the similarity in vocabulary is not as great as is the case with the Romance languages. So, Ukrainian may only share 60% of its vocabulary with Russian. And then Czech and stuff like that. So the vocabulary is a bigger problem, but the fundamental principles of the grammar are very similar, but the actual endings, which is a big bugbear in Slavic languages, can differ quite a bit. And then there are minor differences, a bit like Portuguese and Spanish.
Yeah, and I guess what we're describing here is kind of the basis for, in a way, it's a basis for, if you want to call it polyglottery, is that, isn't it? And I've spoken to Richard Simcott many times about exactly this, about how he likes to work with he likes to work with families of languages, and he will explain that process of kind of using one to kind of springboard onto the next.
Sure.
And it absolutely does get easier. And I think like one of the, sorry to go off at a tangent, but I think this concept of familiarity with the process of acquiring a language is one thing that I see this as a huge advantage for someone that's been through that process. Just the same way, it's a huge disadvantage for someone who hasn't been through the language process before.
Right.
Because if you haven't been through this process of learning a language, you don't know how.
Off here. Sorry.
if you don't know what the steps are like, what the feeling of progressing is like, you end up generating all these feelings. I see this in people all the time, creating all these kind of self-imposed feelings of panic or uncertainty about whether they're doing the right thing or not. And
just a second. Hello, Richard. Hello. Okay, he's gone. All right, let me just pull this off here. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
No
so, fears, yeah?
I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, you're saying that people who have been through the process and know how to learn, and I would agree with you. Not only do they know how to learn, they're confident that they will learn. That if they follow the process that they're used to, they will learn. I think a lot of beginner language learners aren't really confident that they're going to learn. They've never done it before. They have never experienced, mastering another language, so they don't think they're going to get there.
It seems like an insurmountable wall, doesn't it? Although
Just a second. All right, done. Okay. Nowadays you can't even lift the phone off the rocker there because the phones, they've kind of lived separately from their...
Yeah.
Anyway.
But I think this works. Well, once you have been through that process, it compounds for those who have learned a lot of language. And so coming back to this thing of learning your fourth or fifth Romance or Slavic language, it's that you not only have that ability to kind of springboard off what you already know, but that combined with the fact that you have a knowledge and experience of the language learning process, it does make it significantly easier to acquire a new language.
Absolutely. And I think to some extent, and this is something we'll discuss at the Montreal North American... You're going to be there?
I am indeed, yeah.
Excellent.
I can't wait.
Super. The Montreal North American Polyglot Symposium, I think it's called. Which is kind of scary, Actually, I think most of us, I'm looking forward to meeting all these people because I haven't met them, but it's mostly about having fun learning languages. So the word North American Polyglot Symposium may scare people off. Really, it's about having fun learning languages and convincing people that it's really not that difficult, and that people can have different approaches. And like in my case, for example, I'm not too hung up about what I'm able to say 2 or 3 months into the process. I'm more concerned about what I'm going to be able to say 6 months or a year, into the process. Because to me, language learning is not a matter of weeks. Even going from Portuguese to Spanish or Spanish to Portuguese, I've never found it to be a matter of weeks. Now, there are people on the internet who learn Icelandic in 2 weeks, but I'm not one of those. To me, it takes a long time. And so my concern is, what am I going to be able to do with the language? Watch movies, read books, listen to stuff, have intelligent conversations with people. Where am I going to be at after 6 months or a year? So...
Well, this is something that I'd like to ask you about because as I mentioned earlier, my language learning process has always been driven by need or desire or community in some way. It's always been very instinctive. So, you speak many more languages than me, and so I would be interested to know from your perspective, what is the balance for you for these languages that?
Yeah, let's see who that is. Just a second, I'll take it. Hello. Sir, I'm in the middle of a Skype conversation. I can't talk now. Can I talk later? Okay. Thanks, bye. Okay.
So I'd be interested to know from your side, like what, the languages that you've learned, what's the proportion for you for languages that really factor into your daily life and are things that you've learned very much for a purpose, and those which are more of an intellectual pursuit or out of interest. And do those mix? Do you find that languages that you just dabble in, for example, later on become a key part of your life? How does that dynamic work?
Well, the first languages that I learned, French, for example, I got very interested at university and then subsequently went to France and studied there for 3 years. So it was very much a part of my daily life. Chinese, I was working for the Canadian government and I was sent to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin Chinese. It was a full-time job. And I followed up that by going to China regularly with Canadian business people and so forth, late 60s, early 70s. And then I lived in Japan for 9 years. So those 3 languages, which are also my strongest languages, those are languages that I needed. I had a practical need for. But in all of those languages, especially I discovered with the Chinese, my major activity was listening and reading. Like, I believe that no matter what else you do to learn a language, speak, attend class, I find that I can't escape from the necessity to do a lot of listening and reading in the language. And when I lived in Japan, I never went to school, to language school. But I just spent a lot of time listening in the car, reading, listening, reading. Now, when I get to all the other languages, I did business in Sweden. I used my Swedish. I did some business in Germany. But overwhelmingly, it's been more, and certainly with the more recent languages, like the Slavic languages and Korean and so forth, it's more out of interest. Like, I'm reading books right now on Ukrainian history. I'm listening to audiobooks in Polish. I'm learning about, and my motivation there is, I just want to understand Poland as a country, as a culture, Ukraine, Russia, Korea. Of course, when I meet, like I took the trouble of flying to Toronto to spend a day with a bunch of Ukrainian speakers at the Ukraine Canada
photos,
Business Forum, so I like to speak to people, but it's not practical with 15 languages. I can't surround myself with speakers of 15 languages. I also have a social life. I have my wife and my kids and grandchildren.
And sometimes you just want to kick back and watch a bit of TV as well.
Well, I don't actually watch a lot of TV except for hockey, but So I think it's a factor of age too. So certainly when I was living in Japan, I was speaking Japanese every day, doing business and so forth and so on. But right now, I would say that the bulk of it is more of a enjoying, accessing the language, the culture, the history, the country, expanding my horizons, and of course every opportunity. If I were to hear Ukrainian on the street, God, I'd be all over those people. They would be victims.
They wouldn't know what's hit them.
They wouldn't know what's hit them. And Korean is the same way, and Russian or whatever. So obviously you like to use the language, but the emphasis most recently, because it's more practical. Like 70% of my study time is listening. So I listen while cleaning the table and doing the dishes. I listen in the car. I listen while working out. I listen. Then I go and work on Link, as you know, and I save words and phrases, and I kind of mine that text for words and phrases. And then I go back and I listen. So that's the bulk of my experience. I simply can't go out every evening here with Ukrainians and Koreans and Russians and so forth.
Sure. I went to a gathering in Berlin last month, and this is the third time that I've been. And I decided that I wanted to learn a bit of German because it's always been on my radar, but I've never actually taken the step to do it because I've never had that strong enough reason to really start. But I decided to spend a month learning German, and so I just bought a textbook and I worked through it. It's all I did. Very straightforward.
Right.
And I've got to say, it was the most enjoyable learning experience I've had since I can remember, for the simple reason that I was able to read without any particular trouble. Mm-hmm. And I was...
As opposed to Japanese, for example, you mean?
Right, which is what I'm getting on to, because I was absolutely bowled over by not only how...
Uh-oh. We're losing it here.
Same time.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed you there. We had a brief hiccup in our Skype connection. So you were bowled over by
the fact that you can listen and read at the same time, just how much that affects the learning process.
Right.
I've known this for some time, but I've found in the last 3 languages that I've learned, it's been very difficult to do that.
Which are these?
These would be Japanese, Cantonese, and Arabic.
Okay.
Egyptian Arabic, so a dialect of Arabic.
Right.
Now, Japanese to a lesser extent, because you obviously with the hiragana and the katakana, you have a certain access early on.
Right.
Cantonese is not a written language for the most part.
Right.
Arabic dialects are similarly to Cantonese. You just generally don't write them down.
Right.
And so I think if I'd stayed in Japan longer and I'd really focused on reading kanji, then I probably would have progressed a little bit further. But in the case of Cantonese and Arabic in particular, I know some Chinese characters. I don't know anywhere near enough.
Right.
There is no standardized writing system in Arabic dialects. It's all over the place. Even the locals don't know how to write. So I've basically, the last 2 languages I've learned, quite aside from being extremely difficult languages, I have not been able to read for the most part. And I've found this to be absolutely crippling when compared to my previous experiences. Right. Not only have you got a large distance between languages I'm familiar with, but you've got that handicap of not being able to read.
Right.
So I wanted to ask you about your experience with Asian languages and maybe just your general reflections on what I've just said.
First of all, the easier it is to read, the better. So, for example, when I read Polish on Link, I've got this, I'm reading I was able to find an audiobook for which I have the ebook. So I import the ebook into Link and I go through it and I'm saving words and phrases and I can listen to it. And it's in the Latin alphabet. So however much I have read in Russian, and I have read tons in Russian, I have read books, I have read newspaper articles, and I read it without a problem, it's that much easier if it's in your own alphabet. And that's just talking about an alphabet, because the Russian alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet is an alphabet. It's consistent, it's an alphabet. So Chinese, but I've read so much in Chinese, I'm quite comfortable reading in Chinese. I read Chinese better than I read Japanese. And so, but reading to me, language learning is, as I've said before, is words. And the best way to increase your vocabulary is reading. And the listening is where you take your words and develop patterns in your head so that you can eventually use them. Because you gotta hear them, and you gotta hear them again and again and again, and then you start to be able to use them. So to me, it's all about listening and reading. And I don't like listening to stuff that I can't read until I am well enough along in the language that I don't need it. I'm that way in Russian. Like I can listen to news commentary, discussions, whatever, audiobooks in Russian. I understand essentially 80-90% of it. But until you're past 50, I want to read it. So if you, for me, so getting back to Asian languages, my first Asian language was Chinese. And I learned, whatever it was, 3,000-4,000 characters. And my major activity in Chinese was listening and reading. And I learned it very quickly because, unlike a lot of the other people who were studying, I spent a lot of time in those days, long before, that was the day of the open reel tape recorder and stuff. So there was no online dictionary, so there was no link. So I had to buy every possible book I could find that was a Chinese reader with a glossary. And I just went through every book that I could find, and Chinese literature, Chinese history, Chinese this, Chinese that, with glossary. And there were lots of them. And so big focus on reading. Come to Japan, I learned the hiragana, katakana, that's not a big deal. I have a big advantage over other people going at Japanese because I can read the characters, even though they're pronounced differently in Japanese. I don't have to actually go through and learn them all. Now I've already learned them. So yeah, the answer is a lot of people, like if you're living in Egypt and you're talking to people every day, you're going to pick up Egyptian Arabic. But if you're studying in London or in Vancouver, I just think it would be very difficult. Like my method of learning is, and that's why we've created Link, is like focus on listening and reading, build up the vocabulary. And reading is just so powerful because I often think of it this way. It's in the olden days, they had no writing, like 5,000 years ago. So they had oral. And then we got the first way of recording things was writing. And now we have, MP3 players. But it's all different ways of recording the language so that you can then access the language and start creating the neural networks that you need. So, yeah, to me, if you can't read the language, much, much more difficult to learn.
Absolutely.
Much more difficult.
I think, so given, I think the path that you've taken through those Asian languages is probably a very good one. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it seems, starting with Chinese characters, if you're able to get that hard work done out, out the way at the beginning, you've cracked the nut, haven't you? As a result of these difficulties, what I've ended up doing with these languages is overcompensating on the speaking side. Because of the fact that the reading's been so challenging, I learn pretty much exclusively through conversations.
Right.
And my own, in the case of, I invent these kind of pseudo ways of recording words on paper,
right,
in order to speed up. Because the problem is, the other thing about obviously reading and writing is if you can't write quickly, you slow down the whole process so much that it becomes a huge drain on your energy.
Right.
So in the case of Arabic, at the beginning, I'm kind of writing stuff in a kind of weird transliteration, but it serves the purpose of recording something so you can then go off and memorize it. But I very much kind of overcompensate for the speaking. And so in the case of Japanese, I speak Japanese fairly often in London, but I do it through arranging to go out for dinner with friends, just the whole evening speak. And there's no bigger pleasure than that. I mean, I'm in heaven when I'm doing that. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I'm very aware that I would not call it an efficient learning method at all. I mean, I was able to get to that stage thanks to living in Japan.
Right.
But reverse engineering that, I wouldn't feel confident doing it.
Part of the problem too is that I enjoy reading books in the language, learning about the history, blah blah blah, and you need a lot of vocabulary for that. That's the problem with just speaking. It ends up being a much more limited vocabulary. That's all, and it's more difficult to organize. Like I can get in 2 hours just in terms of being in the car and stuff like that. I'm listening, I'm reading. To try to organize, to go out to dinner with a group of Ukrainians is just much more difficult to organize. But just one thing I was going to say, I agree with you that Chinese then to Japanese, and I wish the Koreans used their Hanja, characters. It would make it easier. But I think that it is in fact becoming easier for people to learn multiple languages. And I was just musing today, and I don't want to touch on a sensitive point here, but with Britain out of the European Union, I think it's inevitable that German will become a more important language within the European Union. I mean, already countries in Eastern Europe that trade so heavily with Germany, they're learning German more and more. Undoubtedly, English will be less important. I mean, it's still the Scandinavians and well, I mean, they can also learn German. I just think German will become more important. I mean, if Russia ever becomes a little bit less, aggressive in their approach to world affairs, potentially they could be, in terms of the influence of their language, the Russian language could be quite influential in Europe. Spanish could, obviously in Latin America, it's not so difficult for the Brazilians to learn Spanish. Maybe Spanish, Italian, the Romance languages. We could end up in a situation where, instead of everyone having to learn English, where it would be considered normal that people speak 3 or 4 languages, including, for example, in Asia, Chinese people have a real advantage in learning Japanese or Korean. Japanese people have the characters, they can learn Chinese. In other words, that an educated person, whether he be or she be Asian, Latin American, European, whatever, that it's normal to be a, quote, polyglot, in fact becomes the norm. Not in terms of 15 languages, but in terms of 3 or 4. And so that when you meet with people somewhere, say, what language shall we use? Well, we can speak a bit of Spanish, and we can speak a bit of Japanese, or whatever. I don't know. But that's probably romantic, you know.
It's a fantastic aspiration. I mean, I run a monthly meetup here in London called Polyglot Pub. Mm-hmm. Can't get away from this word polyglot as much as I would like to. But, you know, in those events, you know, we have mostly English people coming down, all of whom are polyglots, all of whom speak a bunch of language. And we sit there and we speak, in fairness, we speak mostly in English. It's one of those kind of meta things, I think. But we're all capable of speaking different languages. My observation on that is that, you know, living in London, which is one of the most multicultural places on earth, you stop your average English person on the street and you ask them to speak in a different language, it's going to be a very short conversation. Yes. You know, now, I obviously, this to a certain extent is because we don't have that much need for other languages, English being the lingua franca. But it is interesting. And I guess I imagine you find the same thing as well in the US. Although perhaps, you know, Spanish being the predominant second language there, I mean, there may be a little bit more there, but it always strikes me how much of an uphill battle it is to try to get native English speakers to learn other languages. And I wonder, even with this amount of multiculturalism around us, I wonder, you know, what it would actually take for that to happen. But it's obviously like a fantastic aspiration.
Well, I think first of all, the situation in Canada is very similar. In Vancouver, unless the person is an Asian origin person, and even there, no guarantee. Just because they look Asian, there's no guarantee they're going to speak Chinese or any Asian language. English on the North American continent is just the most useful language. Period. But I was looking more at other parts of the world. So in Europe, every Dutchman, Swede, Spaniard, and Italian and Pole has to learn English. It may be that they'll be looking at other options like German. If Germany, Austria is the dominant economic force. I just think you could start seeing more sort of regional use of other languages. And it may be that even Brits, although I don't see it, I think if anything, Britain will be more isolated. So maybe there'll be fewer Brits. Although, personally, I think once this stuff blows over, Brits will be traveling to the continent, and the people from the continent will be traveling to Europe. So I don't think there'll be much difference there. But I do think that the importance of other languages, I may be wrong, within the European Union, could increase. That's all.
Absolutely, yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I guess that the question then is, you know, to what extent is the EU part of the global? You know, to what extent can we take that view of the EU, and to what extent is the EU linked to the more global picture where English is, I don't know, it certainly doesn't show many signs of slowing as a lingua franca.
No, but if Germany is the dominant business language in Europe, and I'm a Japanese manufacturer wanting to ship to Europe or to Germany, and if I am convinced that I can learn German, that's part of the problem. You know, then maybe I'd learn German if it's going to benefit me in my business. And maybe we need to teach languages in a way that that gets people interested in different languages better than we do now. You know,
I saw a video that you published the other day about the opportunities that you've had work-wise as a result of language, and I thought that was very, very insightful because often one of the question that comes in is, well, what's the most useful language to learn? You know, or how can I? You know, I've learned German. How can I get a job with that?
Right.
But actually, you know, your analysis of that was a very kind of organic one, and you're saying, well, you know, put yourself in positions where opportunity can arise.
Right.
Language is not being the main driving force there,
yeah.
But as a result of those kind of initiatives, you know, you can find yourself with lots of different opportunities. I've seen that to a certain extent as well when I worked for the British Council, and I think it's very, very interesting, and I definitely recommend people to go and watch that.
You know, Ollie, I think, you know, we don't want to run out of things to talk about when we meet in Montreal. So I have the feeling we could go on for another couple of hours, but maybe we should cut it off here. And so I want to thank you very much for this interesting interview, and I hope this is of interest to the people who follow us on YouTube.
I'm sure it will be. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Steve, after so long, and I hope it's the first of many conversations.
Absolutely. Bye for now.
Okay. Take it easy. Bye-bye.